What if the war you're watching on the news isn't really about nuclear weapons, regime change, or even Israel's security? What if this entire conflict, this war that the Trump administration is waging right now against Iran, is actually the final act in a much larger, much older drama unfolding around the most powerful financial instrument on the planet, the United States dollar? Because here's what they're not telling you clearly enough. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has already fallen to roughly 56.9%, its lowest level since 1995, and down from a peak of 72% back in 2001. And while that might sound like just a number, it is the number that determines whether America can keep borrowing, keep spending, keep projecting military force across the globe, or whether all of that starts to unravel. And right now, in the burning waters of the Persian Gulf, something historic is happening that most Americans are simply not being told about. Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz, the most important oil transit choke point on Earth, and is now demanding that ships which want to pass through must sell their oil in China's currency, the yuan, not the US dollar. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about what has been built upon the dollar's dominance. Think about how long this system has been kept secret from the average American. And then ask yourself, is this conflict really about what they're telling you it's about, or is something far deeper, far more consequential, playing out right before your eyes? Now let me take you through this properly, because this story doesn't begin with Trump, and it doesn't begin with Iran. It begins in 1974 in a room somewhere in Riyadh with Henry Kissinger and a Saudi king, and a secret handshake that would quietly govern the entire global economy for the next 50 years without most people ever knowing it existed. The existence of this secret agreement wasn't even publicly confirmed until 2016, when Bloomberg News filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the National Archives. What Kissinger negotiated after Nixon had blown up the Bretton Woods gold standard in 1971 was something elegant in its simplicity and staggering in its consequences. Saudi Arabia would price its oil in dollars, and other OPEC nations would follow. In exchange, America would guarantee the kingdom's security, troops, weapons, naval protection, and the promise that nobody would threaten the Saudi royal family's grip on power. And what this meant in practice was that every country on earth that needed oil, and every country on earth needs oil, would also need dollars. You couldn't buy the most essential commodity in the global economy without going through the American currency first. That was the deal. That was the petrodollar system. And that is what is now under the most serious threat it has faced since the day Kissinger shook hands with King Faisal. The petrodollar system created a perpetual buyer for US Treasury bonds in the form of oil exporting nations. Oil exporters accumulated vast dollar surpluses and parked them in US assets. This is the mechanism that allowed Washington to run the kind of deficits that would have destroyed any other country. Because when you control the world's reserve currency, when every oil transaction on Earth runs through your monetary system, you get to borrow at artificially low rates. You get to print money that other countries are forced to absorb. You get to fund your military, your welfare state, your entire way of life on terms that no other nation on earth is offered. This was America's greatest secret weapon, not the aircraft carriers, not the nuclear arsenal, the dollar. And what we are watching right now in 2026 is a very deliberate, very coordinated effort to dismantle it. Saudi Arabia quietly canceled the petrodollar agreement in June 2024, 2 years before this war broke out. Most Americans have no idea that happened. It didn't make the front page. It wasn't the lead story on any of the major networks, but it happened. The Saudis, after 50 years of loyalty to this arrangement, let it expire. And what followed in the months after was the quiet acceleration of something the financial world calls de-dollarization, the slow, methodical process by which the rest of the world begins to do business without the American dollar at the center of every transaction. In 2025, during the second presidency of Donald Trump, many countries began moving away from the US dollar as a foreign currency reserve. This coincides with the US beginning to pursue an isolationist foreign policy and an erratic economic policy. BRICS, the bloc of nations that includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now Iran, had already begun settling trade in local currencies, bypassing the Western SWIFT banking system entirely. In 2024, 90% of Russia's trade within BRICS was conducted in local currencies. That is not a small thing. That is the architecture of a parallel financial world being constructed in real time, and Washington has been either unwilling or unable to stop it. Now, here is where the Iran conflict becomes the hinge point of all of this. Following the first US-Israeli attack on Iran, Iran effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the global oil supply is traded. Industry experts reported that some ships are able to pass through the choke point by paying in Chinese yuan. Let that sink in. The most critical oil shipping lane in the world, the narrow strip of water through which a fifth of all global petroleum flows, is now functioning as a toll road for Chinese currency. Iran has turned a military choke point into a financial weapon, and the dollar is the target. Iran's embassy in Zimbabwe announced in a social media post that it was time to add the Petroyuan to the global oil market. Kenneth Rogoff, an economics professor at Harvard University and former chief economist at the IMF, told Al Jazeera that Iran is dead serious about preferring yuan to avoid US sanctions and to cultivate its ally China, which has been moving steadily to redenominate its own trade and that of the BRICS nations into yuan. This is not posturing. This is strategy. And it is strategy that has been years in the making, accelerated by sanctions, shaped by the experience of watching what America did to Russia after Ukraine, and designed with China as the partner that provides both the currency alternative and the security umbrella that replaces the one America once offered the Gulf states. China is following the US playbook when the petrodollar was first cemented by signaling to allied countries in the Gulf that it is able to provide a security umbrella and currency alternative in times of geopolitical stress. Think about that for a moment. China is doing to America what America did to the British Empire in 1944. It is positioning itself as the new guarantor of order, the new provider of security, the new anchor of the global financial system. And the Iran war is the event that is accelerating this transition from theoretical possibility into operational reality. The expansion of the BRICS Plus alliance in 2024 and 2025 has turned the Petroyuan from a hypothetical threat into a functional tool for regional trade. In 2026, countries like the UAE and Egypt are leading the charge in creating non-dollar corridors. The UAE, which has long been a key American partner in the Gulf, is now building what they call digital pipes for de-dollarization. Project M-Bridge, a multi-central bank digital currency platform connecting China, the UAE, Hong Kong, and Thailand, is being used in 2026 to settle hundreds of millions of dollars in trade instantly, bypassing the Western SWIFT system entirely. This is infrastructure, this is not rhetoric or aspiration, this is functioning alternative plumbing for the global financial system being laid down while American bombs fall on Tehran. And here is the part that should disturb every American who is paying attention, because the financial consequences of all of this fall directly on you. The US national debt crossed $39 trillion on March 18, 2026, a milestone reached just weeks into the war in Iran. The US has already suffered credit downgrades from all three major ratings agencies, S&P in 2011, Fitch in 2023, and Moody's in May 2025. And as if that were not enough, the Speaker of Iran's parliament delivered a warning that rattled bond traders. Financial institutions backing the US military budget were legitimate targets, and buyers of US Treasury bonds were purchasing an attack on their own headquarters and assets. Now you can call that theatrical, you can dismiss it as the bluster of a government under bombardment, but it is also a signal, a very deliberate signal, that the dollar's safe haven status, the belief that US Treasury bonds are the most secure investment in the world, is itself now a geopolitical variable. The 10-year Treasury yield climbed to 4.362% as the conflict escalated, up from 3.962% before it started, as investors pared back expectations for Federal Reserve rate cuts. The bond market is not panicking yet, but it is listening. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is where honest analysis becomes essential and where the temptation to overdramatize must be resisted. The dollar is not collapsing tomorrow. About 80% of global oil transactions are still settled in dollars, according to a 2023 estimate by JP Morgan Chase. The yuan represents just a tiny fraction of global reserves. No single currency has emerged as a credible heir apparent to the dollar's throne, and some analysts will tell you that the dollar actually strengthens in wartime because investors flee to safety, which is technically true in the short term. The dollar is getting stronger in the short term due to war uncertainty, but its long-term foundation is eroding as countries build sanction-proof payment rails like China's CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system. This is the paradox that almost nobody in mainstream media is explaining clearly enough. The dollar can be getting stronger in nominal terms right now, measured against other currencies on the index, while simultaneously losing the structural foundations that have made it dominant for half a century. These are two different things. Short-term strength and long-term structural erosion can coexist, and they are coexisting right now in real time in the Persian Gulf. The dollar's dominance is not a cliff, it is a long, slow slope. And the question the Hormuz standoff raises is not whether America falls off the edge today, but whether Trump's handling of this crisis steepens the gradient. And that is the question that nobody in Washington seems to be taking seriously enough. Because what has been the response to Iran using the Strait of Hormuz as a Petroyuan tollgate? More bombing? More threats? Trump and the Israelis are now directly threatening the survival of the Iranian government, having killed the supreme leader and a succession of powerful figures, and encouraging a popular uprising. And Iran is responding as any nation would when its survival is at stake, by going all in, by using every tool at its disposal. And one of those tools, perhaps the most innovative and consequential one, is the financial weapon, the yuan toll, the BRICS payment corridor, the systematic dismantling, transaction by transaction, of the petrodollar architecture. Iran is looking for alternatives to the dollar to challenge the petrodollar regime, which is one of the fundamental pillars of US empire. Iran is hoping to influence the crafting of a world post this war, a new world order where there is a multipolar financial system where the dollar is no longer the single currency that rules the world, and the US is no longer the only power that controls financial channels. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is Iran's stated strategic objective, and it is a sophisticated one because it targets the most vulnerable point in America's global architecture. Not the military, the financial system. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 should have meant the end of US currency hegemony. The dollar became nothing more than paper without physical backing, but it was able to remain a global reserve asset thanks to the role played by petrodollars. The petrodollar system was a geopolitical decision that turned oil into the material support for US monetary hegemony. What Iran understands, and what China has understood for years, is that if you can peel away the oil-dollar linkage, you expose the entire structure beneath it. The US debt becomes harder to finance. The interest payments become larger relative to revenue. The ability to project military power abroad becomes more constrained. It is a cascade of consequences that flows from one source, the loss of the dollar's indispensable role in global energy trade. Iran is effectively challenging the US economy and the dollar's position as the global reserve currency, as well as the petrodollar system. The Strait of Hormuz could become a testing ground for Petroyuan and crypto-based energy transactions, setting a powerful precedent and encouraging BRICS to experiment with non-dollar trade. And this precedent matters enormously because the world is watching. Every government that has worried about American sanctions, every central bank that has quietly diversified away from treasuries, every finance minister who has whispered about the risks of dollar dependency, they are all watching to see whether Iran's gambit works, whether a country can actually stand up to maximum American pressure and use that pressure as the lever to build an alternative financial order. Deutsche Bank warned that the conflict could be remembered as a key catalyst for erosion in petrodollar dominance and the beginnings of the Petroyuan. Any loss of the dollar's exorbitant privilege would also ripple through other areas of global finance, including the bond market. Due to the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency, the federal government has long been able to issue debt at rates lower than investors would otherwise allow. Lose that privilege, and suddenly the mathematics of American public finance become very different. Suddenly, funding a $39 trillion debt at higher interest rates, in a world where fewer countries are forced to hold dollars as reserve assets, becomes an existential fiscal challenge. The Federal Reserve is facing a catch-22 that hasn't been this intense in decades. In March 2026, the Fed projected inflation would hit 2.7%, but the OECD recently countered with a forecast of 4.2%. And bond market strategists are warning that bond vigilantes are tightening credit conditions by repricing government notes to reflect the rapidly deteriorating inflation outlook, with some warning that a bear market and even a recession cannot be ruled out. This is what financial warfare looks like from the inside. Not just bombs and blockades, but yields rising, inflation expectations shifting, and the quiet grinding erosion of confidence in the instruments that American power depends on. What we are living through right now is the intersection of two very different historical timelines. On one timeline, you have the military conflict, the strikes on Iranian nuclear sites, the naval deployments, the casualties, the threats and counter-threats that fill the daily news cycle. On the other timeline, you have a 50-year-old financial architecture quietly disintegrating under the pressure of its own contradictions and the deliberate, strategic actions of the nations it has long oppressed. And those two timelines are now running together, feeding each other, accelerating a transformation that will reshape what America can do in the world for decades to come. Iran sidestepped US sanctions for years before this war, exporting roughly 1.5 to 1.7 million barrels per day, about 90% to China, paid largely in won or barter deals, with proceeds convertible into gold via the Shanghai Gold Exchange. This is a country that has already built, out of necessity, the exact alternative financial infrastructure that the rest of the world is now looking at as a model. And now, with control of the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has an unprecedented amount of leverage, not just militarily, but financially. Every day the strait remains closed or functions as a UN toll road. The habit of paying for oil in non-dollar currencies grows slightly more normalized. Every week the strait stays closed, Asian economies are forced to test alternative supply chains and at the margin, alternative payment mechanisms. If the crisis drags into months, habits begin to form. And habits in finance become infrastructure. Infrastructure becomes institutions. Institutions become the new normal. That is precisely how the petrodollar was built in the first place, not through one dramatic declaration, but through 1,000 quiet transactions over many years that gradually made the dollar indispensable. The Petroyuan is being built the same way, quietly, transactionally, one Hormuz passage at a time. The US failure to ensure security in the Gulf could unwind the premise on which the petrodollar is built. The current conflict has the potential to reveal additional problems that will undermine the US security protection over Gulf infrastructure and maritime operations that safeguard international oil transportation. Gulf states might reduce their dollar-denominated foreign asset investments because economic losses from the Gulf will impact their merchandise value. And when Gulf states, the very nations whose recycled petrodollars have financed American debt for half a century, begin reducing their treasury holdings, the feedback loop becomes very dangerous indeed. The real question that Americans need to be asking right now is not whether Trump is winning or losing the military conflict in Iran. The real question is whether the conflict itself, regardless of how it ends militarily, is being used deliberately or inadvertently to accelerate the end of the dollar era. Because some of the most perceptive analysts looking at this situation are asking exactly that. Whether the chaos, the provocations, the maximum pressure campaigns that have driven country after country to build alternative financial systems, whether all of that has served in the end not to protect American power, but to hasten its financial decline. And the answer to that question will not be found in the daily news cycle. It will be found in the slow, grinding movement of reserve currency share percentages, in the quiet expansion of yuan payment corridors, in the growing network of nations that have decided the cost of dollar dependence is no longer worth paying. That is the real war, and it is the one you need to understand.